They'd hunted King Bela IV from his throne all the way to the Adriatic coast, like a wounded animal, and now they were returning to finish the job. However, there was something the Mongol commanders, Nogai Khan and Talabuga, didn't know as they led their armies toward what they assumed would be an easy conquest. Something had changed in the 4 decades since the last invasion. Something fundamental. Something that would transform Hungary's most devastating military defeat into one of medieval Europe's most remarkable defensive victories. So, what was Hungary's secret weapon? Was it some new technology? A brilliant general? An alliance with a powerful neighbor? The answer was both simpler and more profound than any of those things. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the Mongol war machine that had conquered everything from China to Poland would meet its match in this one determined kingdom. But first, we need to go back to where the story really begins. On a spring night in 1241, Hungary learned what it meant to face the apocalypse. On the evening of April 11, 1241, the Hungarian camp near the Sejo River was celebrating. King Bela Ivy's army had just repelled a Mongol vanguard of the bridge, driving them back with heavy losses. The Hungarian nobles toasted their victory with wine. They had faced the legendary Mongol horde and won. Surely, the threat from the east had been overblown. The scouts who'd warned of the Mongols' inhuman efficiency, their unstoppable tactics, their trail of devastated kingdoms stretching back to the steppes of Asia, they had been dismissed as alarmists. The Hungarians had beaten them at the bridge. The war might be over by morning. It wasn't. It was just beginning. While the Hungarians celebrated, Subutai, one of the greatest military minds in history, was executing a plan that would make this night one of the darkest in European history. He had deliberately sacrificed men at the bridge to create a false sense of security. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, he was crossing the Sejo River several miles south with 30,000 men, moving with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for such a large force. When the Mongols struck the Hungarian camp from 2 directions simultaneously, it was a nightmare made real. Fire arrows arced through the darkness. Early forms of gunpowder bombs exploded among the tents. The Hungarians, trapped in their fortified camp, what had suddenly become a prison, panicked. Bodies piled up at the gates. Those who made it outside were herded by Mongol cavalry into killing zones, where archers cut them down by the thousands. King Bela barely escaped with his life. His brother, Koloman, mortally wounded, died in his arms days later. The Archbishop of Esztergom, 3 bishops, and most of Hungary's military leadership perished in the slaughter. Mongol losses were significant too. Bata Khan himself nearly died and lost 30 of his elite bodyguards, but the scale of Hungarian casualties was catastrophic. By sunrise, the Hungarian royal army had essentially ceased to exist, and that was just the beginning. For the next 12 months, the Mongols systematically devastated Hungary with a thoroughness that still shocks historians. They weren't just conquering. They were making an example of themselves. Village after village was burned. Populations were slaughtered or driven into the wilderness to starve. Chronicler Roger Torrey Major, who survived the invasion, wrote accounts so horrific that modern scholars initially dismissed them as exaggeration. They weren't. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of destruction, mass graves and settlement layers showing simultaneous burning. Between 300,000 and 500,000 people died, a quarter of Hungary's population gone in a single year. Yet here is the detail that would change everything. 10 stone castles survived. Just 10, scattered across a kingdom the size of modern Hungary. Places like Esztergom, Székesfehérvár, and Pannonhalma Abbey, built with proper stone fortifications, held out against everything the Mongols could throw at them. These fortresses had thick stone walls that Mongol siege equipment couldn't easily breach. They had deep wells that couldn't be poisoned. They had stored grain that couldn't be burned. Most importantly, they had time. The Mongols, always moving, always needing fresh pasture for their horses, couldn't afford months-long sieges. The rest of Hungary, defended by earthwork ramparts, wooden palisades, and ditches, fell in days. One German chronicler visiting Hungary in 1241 noted with alarm that the kingdom had almost no cities protected by strong walls or fortresses. That observation would echo in King Bela Ivy's mind for the rest of his life. In March 1242, the Mongols finally withdrew. The death of the great Khan Ogdi back in Mongolia created a succession crisis that required senior Mongol princes to return home. But Bela IV, watching the endless columns of Mongol cavalry disappear to the east, knew with absolute certainty that they would return. The question wasn't if, it was when, and what would he do about it? Bela IV returned to a kingdom that looked like the surface of the moon. Entire regions were depopulated. Administrative centers, traditionally defended by nothing more than wooden towers and earth embankments, had been systematically obliterated. Famine stalked survivors through 1242 and 1243. Many historians would have expected Hungary to collapse into irrelevance, becoming a backwater vulnerable to every ambitious neighbor. But Bela IV did something remarkable. He had proven not to be a great battlefield commander. The disaster at Mohi had shown that, but he was a brilliant strategic thinker. He conducted what we now call an after-action review of the entire catastrophe. His conclusion was simple but revolutionary. Hungary had lost because it had no permanent fortifications worthy of a name. Every place with real stone walls had survived. Everything else had burned. So Bela made a decision that would have been unthinkable before 1241. He abandoned one of the crown's most ancient prerogatives, the exclusive right to build and own castles. In a series of letters and decrees starting in 1242, he essentially told his barons and bishops, "Build castles, real ones, stone ones. I'll give you land. I'll give you privileges. I'll give you serfs to work the construction. Just build fortresses and build them strong." The scale of what happened next is staggering. Over the next 4 decades, Hungary transformed itself. Wooden palisades and earthworks were replaced by thick stone walls. Towers were strategically placed for overlapping fields of fire. Fortresses were stocked with food and water to withstand long sieges. Soldiers were trained to defend rather than charge recklessly. Hungary didn't just rebuild. It became a country designed to survive a Mongol invasion. And when Nogai and Talabuga returned in 1285 to 1287, expecting the same quick victories they had won in 1241, they found a kingdom fundamentally changed. Hungary's secret weapon wasn't a new weapon or a legendary general. It was time, preparation, and the ability to learn. The Mongols could strike terror into unprepared nations, but Hungary had used its trauma as a teacher. 40 years of reconstruction, fortification, and strategic planning had transformed the most vulnerable settlements into citadels that could withstand even the most disciplined and ruthless cavalry army in history. What had been a death sentence in 1241 was now a challenge the Mongols had never faced before. In the first 10 years after the Mongol invasion, 44 stone castles were erected across Hungary. By the end of Bela IV's reign in 1270, nearly 100 fortifications dotted the landscape. Think about that for a moment. A kingdom nearly destroyed, having lost a quarter of its population, economically shattered, somehow found the resources, labor, and willpower to construct 100 stone castles in 40 years. And these weren't crude towers. We're talking serious military architecture. Walls were 2 to 3 meters thick. Corner towers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Gatehouses featured murder holes and multiple portcullises. Deep wells and vast grain storage ensured garrisons could endure long sieges. Many castles were built on hilltops and spaced roughly a day's march apart. Bela was creating a defensive network that forced any invading army to either bypass fortified positions, leaving enemies in their rear, or conduct dozens of simultaneous sieges, which no medieval army could sustain. The centerpiece of this transformation was Buda. In 1241, the city of Pest, sitting vulnerably on flat land beside the Danube, had been one of the first major settlements to fall to the Mongols. Bela's solution was audacious. In 1248, he relocated the entire population to Castle Hill on the opposite bank of the river. This wasn't just moving people. It was creating a fortified capital from scratch on terrain that would make any attacker pay in blood for every meter gained. Within 2 decades, Buda had become not only the commercial heart of Hungary, but also a symbol of the kingdom's refusal to remain a victim. But Bela understood something crucial that many defensive-minded rulers miss. Castles are worthless without the right soldiers to defend them. And here, Hungary had another problem. The kingdom's military tradition was built around light cavalry, fast-moving horse archers in the nomadic style. This had made sense historically. The Magyars, who founded Hungary in the 9th century, were themselves steppe nomads. But the Battle of Mohi had proven conclusively that light cavalry couldn't stand up to Mongol horse archers. The Mongols had invented these tactics. They had perfected them over centuries. Trying to beat them at their own game was suicide. The few Hungarian units that had performed well at Mohi were the heavily armored knights, particularly those from the Knights Templar. These Western-style heavy cavalry, encased in metal and charging with lances, actually caused the Mongols problems in close combat. The Mongol answer to horse archers was more horse archers. Their answer to heavy cavalry charging at full speed was to get out of the way and hope their horses were fast enough. So in 1247, Bela cut a deal with the Knights Hospitaller, one of the great military orders of the Crusades. He granted them land along the southeastern frontier in the region of Severin. In exchange, they would recruit, train, and equip heavy cavalry in the Western style, and crucially, teach Hungarian nobles to do the same. It was military technology transfer on a grand scale. Over the following decades, Hungary transformed its military culture. The light cavalry tradition didn't disappear. It remained useful for raiding and reconnaissance, but the core of the army became armored knights. Nobles who wanted royal favor now needed to show up to campaigns with not just themselves in armor, but with retainers equipped the same way. Bela even created a new class, the 10 lance nobles, in regions like Sepal. They received privileges in exchange for maintaining themselves in full armor and providing mounted soldiers. I want you to appreciate what Bela was asking of his kingdom. Hungary in 1242 was broke. The population was traumatized. The economy was in ruins. And he was demanding that nobles who had just lost friends, family, and wealth pour their resources into fortification projects that would take decades to complete, preparing for an enemy who might not return in their lifetimes. The temptation to rebuild the old Hungary, to return to how things were, must have been overwhelming. But Bela held firm. Here's a remarkable part. The Hungarian people, from nobles to peasants, bought into the vision. They understood, perhaps better than any generation before or since, that the alternative to sacrifice now was extinction later. Peasants hauled stones. Nobles bankrupted themselves building castles. The entire kingdom became one vast construction project and military training ground. The cost was real. Bela had to grant so much land and so many privileges that royal power, which his father had centralized, dispersed again. Many historians view this as a political failure, but that misses the point entirely. Bela understood something more important than academic theories of kingship. You can't rule a graveyard. Better be a weaker king of a strong kingdom than an absolute monarch of ashes. By 1270, when Bela died, Hungary was unrecognizable from the devastated landscape of 1242. Stone castles bristled from hilltops across the realm. A new generation of knights, trained in Western tactics and equipped with lance and sword, formed the core of the army. Towns at walls, cities at citadels. The kingdom had become, in the words of one historian, a porcupine of stone. But the question remained, would it be enough? In 1285, 15 years after Bela's death, the Mongols were coming back. This time, they were bringing everything they had. The winter of 1285 was brutally cold, even by medieval European standards. Through the frozen mountain passes of the Carpathians, the largest Mongol army to invade Europe since 1241 made its way toward Hungary. At its head rode two of the Golden Horde's most formidable commanders, Nogai Khan and Talabuga Khan. Nogai was a veteran of multiple European campaigns, a political mastermind who effectively controlled the western portions of the Mongol Empire. Talabuga was a Khan himself, eager to prove his worth and erase the memory of past setbacks. Together, they commanded an army contemporary sources estimated at anywhere from 60,000 to over 100,000 men, though the higher figure is probably an exaggeration. What the Mongols didn't realize was that Hungary in 1285 was not the same kingdom they had devastated 4 decades earlier. The population was fortified and experienced. Castles formed a dense defensive network that could survive prolonged siege. Heavy cavalry, trained and armored to counter Mongol tactics, formed the backbone of the army. Hungary had learned from history and turned its past defeats into a strategic advantage. This time, the Mongols were the ones facing an enemy that refused to be conquered. Still, by any measure, this was a massive force. The Mongol commanders, Nogai Khan and Talabuga, had every reason to feel confident. Intelligence suggested Hungary was politically fractured. The current king, Ladislaus IV, was young and perpetually in conflict with his barons. A recent Cuman rebellion had further weakened the kingdom. To Nogai and Talabuga, Hungary in 1285 looked even more vulnerable than it had in 1241. They expected, reasonably, that this campaign would be a repeat of the earlier invasion. Swift conquest, massive plunder, and perhaps this time the capture or death of the Hungarian king. They had no idea what awaited them. The invasion plan was sophisticated. 2 columns would strike simultaneously from different directions, preventing the Hungarians from concentrating their forces. Talabuga would lead the main army through the northern Carpathian passes, driving toward Pest in the heart of the kingdom. Nogai would move a smaller but still substantial force through Transylvania in the south, ravaging the countryside and pinning down Hungarian troops there. Standard Mongol operating procedure: plunder for a few months, extract tribute, and return to the steppe with glory and wealth. But from the very first days of the campaign, nothing went according to plan. Talabuga's northern army encountered conditions that even the Mongols, legendary for their toughness, were ill-prepared for. The winter of 1285 to 86 was exceptionally harsh. Heavy snows in the Carpathians slowed the advance to a crawl. More critically, the Mongol army relied on foraging and plunder to feed itself and its thousands of horses. The mountain passes offered almost nothing. Horses began to die. Men began to starve. By the time Talabuga's army emerged onto the plains, thousands of men had already perished before they even saw a Hungarian soldier. When they reached Pest, they found nothing. The city, once a rich prize in 1241, had been abandoned. The population had withdrawn behind the walls of Buda on the far side of the Danube. Talabuga's men torched the empty buildings in frustration, but burning an abandoned city serves neither food nor horses. Then they attempted to attack Buda itself. And here, Bela Ivy's 40 years of preparation struck like a wall. Literally, Buda's fortifications, built on high ground with massive stone walls and multiple defensive layers, were unlike anything the Mongols had faced in Hungary. Every approach was covered by archers. The gates were reinforced and massive, laughing at battering rams. Mongol siege equipment, effective against wooden palisades and earthworks, barely dented the stone masonry. The Mongols tried everything: catapults, fire arrows, waves of assaults. Nothing worked. The Hungarians had food, water, and shelter from behind the walls. They inflicted casualties without losing a man. Every arrow that struck a Mongol was a silent reminder that Buda was not the helpless city of 1241. But it gets worse, or perhaps worse for the Mongols. Buda was not an isolated fortress. It was part of a network. While Talabuga battered himself against the city, Hungarian heavy cavalry sallying out from nearby castles attacked Mongol foraging parties. These were no light cavalry the Mongols could chase down with superior mobility. These were armored knights, crashing into Mongol raiders and vanishing into forests or retreating behind fortified positions before the Mongols could respond. If you were a Mongol commander facing this strategy, what would you have done differently? Honestly, there wasn't a good answer. In the south, Nogai faced similar nightmares. Transylvania, heavily forested and dotted with fortified towns, proved nearly impossible to conquer. Villages could be burned, peasants enslaved. But every time the Mongols approached a real fortress, the story repeated itself. Stone walls, well-supplied defenders, and sieges that could last months if they succeeded at all. Nogai managed to destroy one Saxon fortress, Bon Maikad, but it took weeks and hundreds of casualties. Here's something video games rarely capture. Time is the real enemy in a siege. Every day spent attacking a castle is a day you aren't moving, a day your supplies dwindle, a day your horses eat grain you don't have. And it's a day local forces can gather to strike at you, which is exactly what happened. Local Hungarian forces, settlers, Saxons, and blocks, used their knowledge of forests and mountain passes to wage a campaign of constant harassment. Mongol detachments sent to forage disappeared. Supply trains were ambushed. Isolated camps were attacked at night. The Mongols couldn't pin down these attackers, who simply faded into forests or retreated into castles. The killing blow to the Mongol invasion wasn't purely military, it was logistical. Bela's strategy revealed its genius. Hungarians implemented a scorched earth policy, but with a twist. They weren't destroying resources. They were hiding them. Grain, livestock, food supplies, all moved behind castle walls or into forests and mountains. Mongols, accustomed to living off the land, suddenly found nothing to live on. Contemporary chronicles describe the growing desperation. Talabuga's army, already weakened by the brutal mountain march, began starving. The Galician, Volhynian Chronicle, records thousands of deaths from hunger. Horses, the foundation of Mongol military power, collapsed from lack of forage. By the depth of winter, Mongol cavalry was reduced to infantry, and infantry couldn't execute the rapid campaigns the Mongols specialized in. By late winter, Talabuga's army was collapsing. When King Ladislaus IV finally marched with the royal army, he didn't encounter a confident horde. He found a starving, demoralized rabble desperately trying to retreat. The subsequent battle near Pest was less a fight than a slaughter. Mongol survivors fled toward the Carpathians, pursued relentlessly by Hungarian-like cavalry. Knowing every mountain pass, secular units ambushed them again and again. Chronicles report that Talabuga's army resorted to eating their horses, then dogs, and possibly worse, details too grim to record explicitly. By the time the remnants limped back into Mongol territory, the army had lost a majority of its men. Some estimates placed Mongol casualties at 50 to 70%. The disaster was complete. The invading force had failed to achieve its objectives, suffered catastrophic losses, and had been turned into a fragmented, starving army. Nogai fared slightly better in the south, but even he was forced to hold out until spring 1286 without achieving any major victories. The invaders of 1241, who had once swept through Hungary like an unstoppable storm, were now humbled. Hungary had changed. Its cities, castles, and soldiers had transformed the kingdom into a fortress network that no Mongol horde could overwhelm. The invaders had learned, as all great armies eventually do, that preparation, strategy, and adaptation could turn even a fraction of a kingdom into an insurmountable obstacle. But Talabuga faced the same grinding reality as Nogai. Every castle he approached was impregnable. Every attempt to forage was ambushed. And every day his army grew weaker. After suffering several serious defeats at the hands of local forces, and note, these weren't even the Hungarian royal army, just regional militias and noble retainers, Talabuga withdrew. His column was further harassed by settlers during the retreat, suffering heavy casualties. The contrast with the invasion of 1241 could not have been starker. 44 years earlier, the Mongols had conquered most of Hungary in a matter of months, killing a quarter of the population and annihilating the kingdom's army. Now, they could not take a single major castle. They could not force the Hungarian king into battle on their terms. They could not even feed themselves. The invasion was a comprehensive, humiliating failure. So, what was Hungary's secret weapon? It wasn't a weapon at all. It was a system. First, the network of stone castles had transformed the strategic landscape. An army can defeat another army in a single afternoon, but an army cannot defeat 100 castles in a single campaign. Each fortress represented a commitment of time and resources that the Mongols, always mobile, always dependent on speed, could not afford. The Mongols were the hammer. Bela had turned Hungary into a mountain of granite. Second, the military reforms created a force specifically designed to counter Mongol tactics. Heavy cavalry could not beat Mongols in open ground one-on-one, but they did not have to. Operating from fortified bases, launching sudden strikes against dispersed Mongol forces, and retreating behind walls changed the equation entirely. The Mongols' greatest strength, their mobility, became a weakness when they could not pin down an enemy or safely rest and regroup. Third, the defensive strategy paired fortifications with scorched earth tactics, exploiting the Achilles heel of steppe armies. Supply? The Mongols had conquered most of Eurasia in part because their armies traveled light and lived off the land. Take that away, and you are left with an army that is starving, stationary, and vulnerable. Fourth, and this is often overlooked in purely military analyses, there was something else at work. Call it national determination, call it collective memory, call it whatever you like. The Hungarians of 1285 had grown up hearing stories of 1241. They had watched their fathers and grandfathers spend decades preparing for this moment. When the invasion finally came, they knew exactly what to do. Hold the walls, hide the food, harass the enemy, wait. The Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1285 marked a turning point for the Golden Horde. The failed campaign shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Mongol arms for generations. After this disaster, there would be no more major invasions of Hungary, only minor border raids that accomplished nothing. The westward expansion of the Mongol Empire, what had seemed unstoppable in the 1240s, had hit a wall it could not break through. For Hungary, the victory validated everything Bela had worked for. The king, derided by some contemporaries for wasting resources on castles and weakening royal authority by granting privileges to nobles, had saved his kingdom. Modern historians call him the second founder of Hungary, and it is not hyperbole. Without Bela's vision and the 40 years of preparation that followed, Hungary would almost certainly have been absorbed into the Mongol Empire. Instead, it survived to become one of the great powers of late medieval Europe. The castles Bela built would continue to serve Hungary for centuries. When the Ottoman Turks invaded in the 15th and 16th centuries, they faced many of the same fortifications that had stymied the Mongols. Defensive infrastructure created in response to one existential threat ended up protecting the kingdom against an entirely different one. This is what good strategic planning looks like. Building capabilities that remain relevant even as circumstances change. There's a broader lesson here about defensive warfare that resonates even today. In a modern era shaped by blitzkrieg and shock and awe, we tend to think of defense as passive, reactive, and inferior to offensive action. Hungary's victory over the Mongols demonstrates that defense, when properly conceived and executed, can be devastatingly effective. Defense is not standing still and taking hits. It is creating a system that makes conquest so expensive, so time-consuming, and so uncertain that even a superior attacker cannot sustain the effort. Think of Finland's winter war against the Soviet Union in 1939-40. Think of Vietnam's decades-long resistance to larger powers. Think of Ukraine's ongoing defense against Russian invasion. In each case, defenders are not matching attackers tank for tank or soldier for soldier. They are making conquest so costly that the attacker cannot pay the price. They are extending the timeline beyond what the attacker can sustain. They are turning military advantage into a strategic quagmire. That is precisely what Hungary achieved in 1285. And that is why we are still talking about it 740 years later. The Mongols were the most effective military force of the 13th century. They conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They defeated every major army they faced, from China to Poland. Their tactics, their mobility, their ruthlessness, all were optimized for conquest. And yet, in Hungary, they lost, not because Hungary was stronger, not because it had better soldiers or more men. Hungary won because it had learned from defeat, prepared systematically, and executed a strategy that turned Mongol strengths into vulnerabilities. In 1241, the Mongols had taught Hungary how to die. By 1285, Hungary had taught the Mongols that some nations refuse to stay dead. If you found this deep dive into military history fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We cover more stories like this, forgotten battles, unlikely victories, and the strategies that changed history every week. And here's my challenge to you. Share this story with someone who thinks history is boring. If the tale of a devastated kingdom spending 40 years preparing for revenge against the most feared army in the world doesn't get your blood pumping, nothing will. Remember this. The best weapon isn't always the biggest or flashiest. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's preparation. And sometimes it's the absolute refusal to give up